Chicago's skyline sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Lux Hotel restaurant, a tapestry of lights against the night. Ryan Holt sat at a corner table, his dark suit sharp against the white tablecloth, his blue eyes cold as the winter wind outside. At 34, he was the CEO of Holt Financial, a name that commanded boardrooms and headlines. Tonight, though, he was just a man on another blind date, the 7th this month. His mother had insisted, her voice sharp over the phone. "You need someone, Ryan." He disagreed, silently sipping his whiskey, waiting for the inevitable disappointment. The woman across from him, a blonde in a red dress, laughed too loud, her words tumbling over each other. She talked about her yoga studio, her vacation in Paris, her designer dog. Ryan barely listened, his jaw tight. 3 minutes in, he'd heard enough. He set his glass down, cutting her off mid-sentence. "This isn't working," he said, voice flat. Her smile froze, then faded. "Excuse me?" she stammered. He stood, adjusting his cufflinks. "Good night," he said, walking away without a glance back. The restaurant hummed on, oblivious. He'd rejected them all, every woman his assistant Claire lined up. Too shallow, too eager, too fake. They wanted his money, his name, not him. Not that he'd let them close enough to try. 3 years ago, his sister Emily died in a car crash, flames swallowing her screams as he watched, helpless. The guilt gnawed at him, a wound he buried under work and walls. Love was a luxury he didn't deserve, a risk he wouldn't take. Blind dates were just a chore to quiet his mother's nagging. Mia Foster moved through the restaurant, a tray balanced in her hands. At 27, she was a waitress here, her brown hair tied back, her apron stained with coffee. She'd worked the Grand Lux for 2 years, saving every tip for a dream she barely spoke of. Tonight, she served Ryan's table, unnoticed as he dismissed yet another date. She cleared the blonde's untouched wine, her hazel eyes catching a flicker of his expression, hard but hollow. She felt a pang, recognizing loneliness when she saw it. The next date arrived, a brunette in pearls, her voice crisp with confidence. She listed her Ivy League degrees, her startup ideas. Ryan leaned back, arms crossed. 2 minutes passed before he stood. "Not interested," he said, sharp and final. She blinked, mouth open, but he was already gone, heading for the bar. Mia watched, stacking plates. He's tough, she thought, but kept her distance. Her job was to serve, not to judge. She reached for a glass, her bracelet slipping from her wrist, clattering to the floor. It rolled under Ryan's table, a silver chain with a tiny star charm. Mia knelt to grab it, her fingers brushing the carpet. Ryan turned from the bar, his gaze landing on her. The bracelet caught his eye, a jolt running through him. Emily had one just like it, a gift he'd given her for her 16th birthday. He froze, memories flooding back, the crash, the fire, her voice fading. Mia stood, slipping the bracelet back on, oblivious to his "Sorry," she said, soft and quick, hurrying away with her tray. Ryan's chest tightened, his whiskey forgotten. That bracelet, it couldn't be the same, could it? He shook his head, dismissing it as coincidence, but her voice lingered, gentle, a contrast to the chatter around him. He signaled the bartender, ordering another drink, but his eyes followed her. She moved with quiet grace, refilling water, smiling at a fussy guest. She didn't flaunt, didn't demand attention. He frowned, unsettled. Who was she? Mia felt his gaze, a prickle on her neck. She glanced over, catching his blue eyes, intense and unreadable. Her pulse jumped, but she turned away, focusing on her work. He was just another rich guy, she told herself, though something about him stuck. She'd seen him reject woman after woman, a pattern she couldn't figure out. Maybe he's broken, she thought, stacking dishes in the back. She knew broken. 3 years ago, she'd lost her best friend in a crash, a night she'd buried deep. Ryan finished his drink, the burn doing little to quiet his mind. The bracelet nagged at him, a splinter he couldn't pull out. He'd rejected every date tonight, as always, but that waitress, she'd slipped past his radar. Not that it mattered, he told himself, standing to leave. He tossed cash on the bar, more than the bill, and headed for the door. The city lights glowed outside, cold and distant. matching the chill in his chest. He didn't need anyone. Never would. Mia watched him go, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd. She cleared his table, finding a 20 tucked under his glass, no note. Generous tipper, she thought, pocketing it. Her bracelet glinted under the lights, a keepsake from her friend, a reminder of loss. She didn't know why he'd stared, didn't care. Or so she told herself. Back in the kitchen she scrubbed plates, the noise drowning her thoughts, but his face lingered, a puzzle she didn't mean to solve. Ryan stepped into the night, the wind biting his skin. He climbed into his car, the engine humming to life. Another night, another rejection. His mother would call tomorrow, annoyed. He didn't care. But as he drove past the hotel, the waitress flashed in his mind. Her bracelet, her voice. He gripped the wheel tighter, pushing it down. She was nothing, a fleeting distraction. Yet deep down, a spark flickered, small but stubborn, refusing to fade. The Grand Lux Hotel restaurant buzzed with life, a symphony of clinking glasses and murmured voices. Chicago's skyline glittered beyond the windows, a backdrop to the evening rush. Mia Foster wove through the tables, her apron snug around her waist, her brown hair pulled into a loose bun. She balanced a tray of drinks, her hazel eyes scanning the room for empty glasses or raised hands. 3 weeks had passed since she'd dropped her bracelet at Reinhold's table, and he'd become a fixture, a dark figure in a sea of chatter. Ryan sat at his usual corner spot, his suit pristine, his blue eyes scanning the latest blind date across from him, a redhead this time, her voice bright as she talked about her art gallery. He sipped his coffee, barely nodding. 4 minutes in, he'd heard enough. "I'm not feeling it," he said, voice clipped. She stopped, brows lifting. "Seriously?" she asked. He stood, adjusting his tie. "Good luck," he said, walking to the bar without a backward glance. Another rejection, clean and cold. Mia watched from the sidelines, clearing a nearby table. He'd turned down 10 women since that first night, each one polished and poised, each one gone in a blink. She didn't get it. He was rich, handsome, powerful, yet he pushed everyone away. She stacked plates, her bracelet catching the light. That night he'd stared at it, replayed in her mind, his eyes sharp, almost haunted. She shook it off, heading to the kitchen, but his presence tugged at her, a quiet mystery. Ryan settled at the bar, ordering a whiskey. His assistant Claire had texted, "Another one bites the dust?" He ignored it, his gaze drifting to Mia. She moved with purpose, refilling water for a loud couple, smiling despite their complaints. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. He'd noticed her more each night, her quiet strength a contrast to the women he dismissed. Tonight, after the redhead left, Mia approached his table, tray empty. "Rough day, huh?" she said, her voice soft, no judgment. He looked up, caught off guard. "You could say that," he replied, his tone less sharp than usual. She smiled, small but warm. "Want some tea instead of that coffee?" she asked. "Keeps the edge off." He blinked, then nodded. "Sure," he said. She returned with a steaming cup, setting it down. He took it, their fingers brushing for a split second. "Thanks," he said, quieter now. She nodded, heading back to work, leaving a faint warmth in her wake. The next night he requested her as his server. Mia raised a brow but complied, bringing his whiskey before the date even started. A blonde this time, all sharp heels and sharper words. 3 minutes, and Ryan cut her off. "Not my type," he said, standing. She huffed, storming out. Mia cleared the table, catching his eye. "You're tough," she said, half teasing. He smirked, a rare crack in his ice. "They're not worth it," he replied. She tilted her head. "Maybe you're just picky," she said, walking away. Their talks grew, small stitches in the fabric of his nights. She'd bring him tea after each rejection, lingering a moment longer. One night, a brunette left in tears, and Mia stayed. "Busy day?" she said, wiping the table. "Tell me about it," he replied, surprising himself. She grinned. "Had a guy spill wine on purpose, thought it'd impress me," she said. Ryan chuckled, a low sound. "Did it?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nope, just got me a bigger tip," she said. He laughed, real this time, the sound foreign to his ears. She opened up too, bit by bit. "I want to help people," she said one evening, stacking cups. "Trauma victims, folks who've been through hell. Lost my friend a while back, makes you think." Ryan's chest tightened, her words echoing Emily's loss. He didn't reply, just sipped his tea. But her dream stuck with him. She didn't know his hell, didn't need to. Yet her kindness chipped at his walls, a slow thaw he couldn't stop. Mia felt the shift, his eyes following her more, his voice softening when she spoke. He tipped big, left notes now, thanks, Mia scrawled on napkins. She pocketed them, her bracelet jingling as she worked. He was different, not the cold CEO she'd first seen. She liked their chats, liked his rare smiles, but she kept her distance, her past a locked box. 3 years ago she'd pulled a man from a burning car, her friend dying beside him. She didn't talk about it. Didn't want to. He was just a customer, she told herself. Ryan watched her from the bar, the restaurant winding down. Another date rejected, a tall woman in black gone in 2 minutes. Mia brought his tea unasked. "Everyone deserves a good night," she said, setting it down. He looked at her, blue eyes searching. "Not me," he said, quiet, almost a confession. She paused, then smiled. "Maybe you just don't see it yet," she replied, walking away. He stared after her, the tea warm in his hands, her words sinking deep. The city lights glowed outside, a steady pulse. Ryan finished his drink, leaving cash and a note. "You're good at this." He stood, coat over his arm, the restaurant emptying. Mia's voice floated back, joking with a coworker, and he felt it, a pull he couldn't name. She was nothing like the women he turned down, nothing like anyone. He stepped into the night, the cold biting, but her warmth lingered, a crack in his ice he couldn't close. Mia locked up later, the bracelet heavy on her wrist. She thought of Ryan, his laugh, his quiet, "not me." He was broken, she saw it now, like she'd been. She didn't know why he rejected them all, didn't need to. But as she walked home, Chicago's wind at her back, she wondered about him, a man who didn't believe in good nights. Maybe she'd change that, just a little. The Grand Lux Hotel restaurant glowed softly, its chandeliers casting a warm haze over the late crowd. Chicago's skyline stretched beyond the windows, a quiet witness to the evening's end. Mia Foster stood behind the counter, wiping down a tray, her apron loosened after a long shift. Her hazel eyes flickered to Ryan Holt's corner table, empty now. He'd left an hour ago, rejecting another blind date, a woman in a sleek blue dress gone in 3 minutes flat. She'd brought him tea, their usual ritual, and he'd left a note. "Thanks, Mia," with a $50 tip. She smiled, tucking the cash away, her bracelet jingling on her wrist. 3 weeks of chats had turned him into more than a customer, a quiet presence she looked forward to. His rejections puzzled her, but his softening edges, the way he listened, kept her curious. She grabbed her bag from the staff room, ready to head home, when her journal slipped out, thudding to the floor. She bent to grab it, but a coworker called her back to the floor. She left it, unaware of the storm it would unleash. Ryan returned to the restaurant, his coat slung over his arm. He'd forgotten his phone, left on the bar after a distracted night. The latest date, a lawyer with a sharp laugh, had grated on him, and Mia's tea had been his only solace. He nodded to the host, slipping into the staff room to ask if they'd found it. The room was empty, lights low, and there on the floor lay a worn notebook. He picked it up, curious, flipping it open. Mia's name stared back in neat handwriting, followed by pages of her life. He should have stopped, but he didn't. He skimmed, her words pulling him in, dreams of helping trauma victims, stories of rude guests. Then a date caught his eye, 3 years back, March 17. His breath stopped. "I pulled a man from a burning car tonight," she'd written. "Flames everywhere, my hands shaking. He was alive, I got him out, but Jen didn't make it. I ran, couldn't face it. Guilt's heavy." Ryan's hands trembled. The crash flooding back, Emily's screams, the heat. He'd woken in a ditch, saved by someone he never saw. Mia. He clutched the journal, heart pounding. She'd saved him that night on the highway, his car wrecked by a hit and run. He'd always wondered who, always assumed they'd died too. But here she was, serving him tea, smiling through her own pain. He left the staff room, journal in hand, and waited by the bar. Mia emerged from the kitchen, her shift done, and froze when she saw him. His face was pale, eyes locked on her, the notebook open in his grip. "Mia," he said, voice rough. She stepped closer, dread pooling in her stomach. "Where'd you get that?" she asked, quiet but firm. He held it up. "You dropped it," he said. "I read it." Her breath hitched, panic flashing. "You had no right," she said, reaching for it. He pulled back, gentle but steady. "March 17, he said. "You pulled me from that car." She froze, eyes wide. He stepped closer, voice breaking. "You saved me." Her knees weakened, memories rushing in. Fire, smoke, Jen's cries. "I didn't know it was you," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not till now." Ryan's gaze softened, gratitude spilling out. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. She looked away, tears welling. "I couldn't face it," she said. "My friend died. I ran. I thought you'd hate me for surviving when she didn't." He set the journal down, closing the gap. "I don't hate you," he said. "You're the reason I'm here." Mia wiped her eyes, voice trembling. "I'm sorry I didn't do more," she said. Ryan touched her arm, light but sure. "You did enough," he said. "More than enough." She met his gaze, seeing past the CEO, the cold mask, to a man cracked open. "Tell me about her," he said, soft. "Your friend." Mia swallowed, nodding. "Jen," she said. "She was brave, funny. We were driving home, then everything went wrong." He listened, silent, her words a bridge between their losses. He opened up too, words spilling out. "My sister Emily," he said. "She was in that crash. I couldn't save her. The guilt's been eating me alive." Mia's hand found his, a reflex. "You're not to blame," she said. "Neither of us are." He squeezed her fingers, a lifeline in the quiet. They stood there, the restaurant emptying, a bond forging in shared scars. "I've been running too," he said. "From this, from everyone, until you." She pulled her hand back, overwhelmed. "I need to go," she said, grabbing her journal. He nodded, stepping aside. "Thanks, Mia," he said, raw and real. She paused, then smiled, faint but true. "Good night, Ryan," she replied, slipping out. He watched her go, the city lights framing her exit. She'd saved him once, physically, and now something else was shifting, a thaw he couldn't stop. Mia walked home, Chicago's wind cold against her tears. She'd kept that night locked away. Jen's death, her failure. Ryan knowing changed everything. His voice echoed, "You saved me," and her chest ached with relief and fear. She didn't deserve his gratitude, not when Jen was gone. But his touch lingered, his story twining with hers. She clutched her bracelet, a tether to the past, wondering what came next. Ryan stayed at the bar, leaving a 50 with a note, "Thank you, Mia." He'd rejected every woman, built walls no one could climb. But she'd slipped through, not with words or wealth, but with a truth he couldn't ignore. The night stretched on, and for the first time in years he felt lighter, her kindness a crack in his ice he didn't want to seal. Rain streaked the windows of the Grand Lux Hotel restaurant, a soft patter against the warm glow inside. Mia Foster stood behind the counter, her apron folded neatly after her shift, her hazel eyes distant. Chicago's skyline blurred beyond the glass, a city oblivious to the storm brewing in her chest. Last night, Ryan Holt had uncovered her secret, her journal spilling the truth of that fiery crash 3 years ago. She'd saved him, pulled him from the wreckage, and he'd thanked her, his voice raw with gratitude. It should have felt good, but it didn't. Not entirely. Ryan sat at his corner table, a new blind date across from him, a woman in a gold dress with a sharp smile. He'd barely listened, his mind on Mia. She'd saved him, a fact that shifted everything. He'd rejected every woman, built walls to keep the world out, but she'd slipped past, her quiet strength a light he couldn't ignore. The date prattled on about her fashion blog and he cut her off. "This isn't working," he said, standing. She scoffed. But he was already gone, heading for the bar, his eyes finding Mia. She felt his gaze, a pull she couldn't shake. He'd left her a note last night, "Thank you, Mia," and she'd barely slept, replaying his words. She grabbed a teapot, pouring him a cup, her hands steady despite the tremble inside. She crossed to the bar, setting it down. "Rough night?" she asked, soft as always. He nodded, taking the tea. "Always," he said, but his tone was lighter, his blue eyes searching hers. "Thanks," he added, quieter. She smiled, faint but real, and turned back to work. He watched her go, the restaurant's hum fading. Her journal burned in his memory, every word a lifeline to that night. He'd kept it, meaning to return it, but curiosity gnawed at him. After she left, he'd read more, needing to understand her, the woman who'd saved him. He pulled it from his coat now, flipping past the crash entry, her dreams, her guilt. Then a line stopped him cold. "I left her there," she'd written. Thought she was dead, but she moved, moaned. "I ran, too scared to look back." Jen was gone, but the other girl wasn't. Not yet. Ryan's breath caught, his hands tightening on the pages. The other girl, Emily, his sister. The crash flashed back, flames licking the car, Emily's voice fading. He'd assumed she'd died instantly, but this, Mia's words, said otherwise. She'd seen Emily alive, moving, and fled. His stomach churned, rage rising. She could have saved her, he thought, teeth clenched. He slammed the journal shut, standing so fast his chair scraped the floor. Heads turned, but he didn't care. He needed answers. Mia finished wiping a table, sensing the shift. She looked up, seeing Ryan stride toward her, his face a mask of fury. Her heart sank. "Ryan," she said, cautious. He stopped close, voice low, shaking. "You left her," he said. She froze, confusion flickering. "What?" she asked. He pulled the journal from his coat, opening it to the page. "Emily," he said, "my sister. You wrote this, she was alive, and you ran." Mia's eyes widened, dread flooding her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't know." He stepped closer, voice rising. "You saw her move, heard her, and you left her to die," he said, each word a blade. Mia's knees buckled, tears spilling. "I thought she was gone," she said, voice breaking. "It was chaos, fire everywhere. I was scared. I didn't know she was your sister, I swear." He laughed, bitter and hollow. "Scared," he said. "You're a coward." She flinched, hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she said, barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't think." He shook his head, disgust in his eyes. "You let her die," he said, turning away. Mia reached for him, desperate. "Ryan, please," she said, but he yanked his arm back. "Don't," he snapped. "You're a liar, hiding behind that smile." "I trusted you." He stormed out, the journal clutched tight, leaving her in the quiet. The restaurant stilled, eyes on her, but she didn't see them. She sank to the floor, sobs tearing free. Jen's death had broken her, and now this. Emily, Ryan's sister. She'd run, yes, but she'd thought no one else could be saved. She'd been wrong, and it crushed her. Ryan hit the alley outside, rain soaking his coat. His chest heaved, anger and grief tangling into a knot. Mia's face flashed, her tears, her pleas, but he pushed them down. She'd left Emily, alive, to burn. He'd thanked her, let her in, and she'd betrayed that night's truth. He threw the journal into a puddle, pages splaying in the wet, and walked into the storm. Emily's voice echoed, faint and lost, and he blamed Mia, a coward in a waitress's apron. Mia stumbled to the staff room, grabbing her bag. She couldn't stay, couldn't face the stairs. She quit on the spot, her manager's protests a blur. She ran into the rain, the city swallowing her steps. Her bracelet weighed heavy. Jen's gift, now a chain of guilt. She'd saved Ryan, yes, but Emily's moan haunted her, a sound she'd buried. She'd lost him, lost the warmth of their nights, and it hurt more than she'd expected. She didn't deserve his forgiveness, didn't deserve anything. Ryan reached his car, slamming the door. The rain drummed on the roof, matching his pulse. He'd rejected every woman, kept them out, but Mia had slipped through, and this was the cost. He started the engine, the journal's words searing his mind. She'd seen Emily alive and run. He couldn't forgive that, couldn't look at her, but as he drove, her face lingered, her tears, her broken, "I'm sorry." A crack of doubt pierced his rage, small but sharp, and he hated it. Mia stopped in an alley, rain mixing with her sobs. She leaned against a wall, the Grand Lux a distant glow. She'd lost Jen, lost herself that night, and now Ryan. Her kindness, her dreams, none of it erased the truth. She'd failed Emily, failed him. The city moved on, cold and vast, and she stood alone. A heroine turned villain in his eyes, her heart shattered by a past she couldn't change. Chicago's dawn painted the sky in soft pinks, a gentle glow over the city's restless hum. Mia Foster stood behind the counter of a small cafe, miles from the Grand Lux Hotel. Her apron hung loose, her brown hair tied back, her hazel eyes dulled by sleepless nights. 2 weeks had passed since Ryan Holt's fury shattered her world, his words echoing in her mind, "You let her die." She'd quit the hotel, fleeing his rejection, and landed here, serving coffee to early risers. Her bracelet dangled on her wrist, a reminder of Jen, of Emily, of guilt she couldn't shake. Ryan sat in his sleek office at Holt Financial, the skyline sprawling beyond his desk. Papers littered the surface, reports on the crash 3 years ago. He'd spent days digging, nights replaying Mia's tears, her broken "I'm sorry." He'd thrown her journal away, walked away from her, but the doubt lingered, a splinter in his rage. She'd saved him, pulled him from flames, yet left Emily. He needed truth, not just her words. He'd hired investigators, piecing together that night, chasing a clarity he wasn't sure he wanted. Mia poured coffee for a regular, her smile forced. She'd lost more than a job that night. She'd lost him. His voice, his rare laughs, the way he'd softened over tea. Gone. She blamed herself, her panic, her failure. Jen's death had broken her, but Emily's moan, faint in memory, crushed her anew. She didn't deserve Ryan's trust, didn't deserve the warmth she'd felt. The cafe door chimed and she looked up, freezing. Ryan stood there, his suit rumpled, his blue eyes raw with something she couldn't name. He crossed to her, slow and deliberate, the cafe quiet around them. Mia's hands trembled, coffee sloshing. "Ryan," she said, voice small. He stopped, close enough to see her tears welling. "I was wrong," he said, low and steady. She blinked, confused. "About what?" she asked. He pulled a folder from his coat, setting it on the counter. "The crash," he said. "It wasn't your fault." She stared, breath catching. He opened it, revealing photos, reports. "A rival, Mark Grayson," he said. "He tampered with my car, wanted me dead to tank my company. You saved me from him." Mia's knees weakened, leaning on the counter. "I don't understand," she whispered. He stepped closer, voice softening. "Emily," he said. "She didn't have minutes, seconds maybe. Grayson's men confirmed it. She was gone before you ran. You couldn't have saved her. No one could." Tears spilled down her cheeks, relief and pain tangling. "I heard her," she said, choking. "I thought if I'd stayed." He shook his head, firm. "You did enough," he said. "More than enough. You saved me, Mia, when I didn't deserve it." She wiped her face, voice trembling. "You called me a coward," she said. He flinched, guilt flashing. "I was angry," he said, "hurt. I blamed you because I couldn't blame myself anymore. I'm sorry." He knelt right there in the cafe, pulling her gaze to his. "I was wrong about you, about everything," he said. She stared, heart pounding. "Why are you here?" she asked. He stood, closer now. "Because you're still in my head," he said, "every night. Every rejection. You were there. I can't let you go." Mia's breath hitched. his words cracking her walls. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded paper, a plan for a trauma fund in Emily's name. "I want you to run this," he said, handing it to her. "Help people, like you wanted, like you helped me." She took it, fingers brushing his, tears blurring the ink. "You don't have to," she said. He smiled, faint but real. "I do," he said. "You're my light, Mia. Through all this dark." She looked up, caught by his eyes, steady and true. He stepped back, giving her space. "I love you," he said, simple, raw. She froze, the words stealing her air. Her guilt, her fear, they fought back, but his face, his voice, pulled her in. "I love you too," she whispered, barely audible. He closed the gap, cupping her face, and kissed her, soft, desperate, a promise in the quiet cafe. Her hands found his coat, clinging as tears mixed with the kiss. The world faded, just them, a lifeline reborn. They pulled apart, foreheads touching, breath mingling. He led her outside to the hotel's balcony where it all began. The city stretched below, dusk settling in. "I want this," he said, hand in hers. "Us. But I need to know. Can you forgive me?" She smiled, fragile but sure. "I already have," she said. Then she paused, voice trembling. "Can you forgive me fully, Ryan? For running? For not being enough?" He squeezed her hand, eyes searching hers, a question hanging in the silence. The skyline glowed, a canvas of light and shadow. Mia's bracelet glinted, a tether to their past, their pain. Ryan's thumb traced her knuckles, his answer unspoken but felt. They stood there, the balcony a perch above their storm. Love fragile yet fierce. She'd saved him, he'd found her, and now they faced a future neither had planned. The city hummed on, and Mia wondered if forgiveness could heal them both, a quiet hope in the dusk. Ryan and Mia's story began in a Chicago hotel, a dance of rejection and quiet kindness. He was a CEO, cold and untouchable, turning away every woman who crossed his path, blind dates fading into the night. She was a waitress, sweet and steady, serving tea to a man who didn't know she'd once saved his life. Their worlds collided in small moments, her smile cracking his ice, his gaze finding her through the crowd. She'd pulled him from a burning car, a secret buried in guilt, and he'd fallen hard, not for her deed, but for her heart. The truth tore them apart, a dark twist in the flames. He learned she'd run, leaving his sister Emily behind, and his love turned to rage. She fled, broken by his words, her kindness no shield against the past. But the real story wasn't hers to bear. A rival's betrayal set that fire, and Ryan chased the truth to find her again. On a cafe counter, then a hotel balcony, he knelt, offering forgiveness, a fund in Emily's name, and his love. She asked, "Can you forgive me fully?" A question lingering in the dusk, a love tested but unbroken. This tale shows, love isn't simple, it's forged in fire, mended with trust. Ryan rejected all until Mia's warmth broke through, her secret a wound that healed them both. Can forgiveness bridge a past so heavy? Their kiss says yes, but her doubt whispers maybe. What stole your heart, his cold rejections, her hidden heroism, or their fragile dawn? Love heals when we let it, even through storms no one sees coming. Hey, it's Emma from Emma's Stories. If Ryan and Mia's journey touched you, drop a love heals in the comments below. Tell me your favorite moment, the tea, the fight, the balcony. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Share this with someone who needs hope. Subscribe now for more tales of love and redemption. Let's keep feeling together. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.